There is a moment that happens in a man's life that nobody prepares him for. A quiet moment, almost invisible, when the noise fades, when the phone stops vibrating, when the attention disappears, when the validation he once relied on slowly evaporates into silence. And suddenly he finds himself alone in his own space, not temporarily, not accidentally, but completely, without a girlfriend, without a woman waiting for him, without someone to witness his existence on a daily basis. And in that moment, society whispers something dangerous into his mind. It tells him that he has failed, that he is incomplete, that he is somehow less of a man. And this is the lie that traps millions of men, not because it is true, but because it is repeated so often that it begins to feel like truth. And yet, beneath that silence, beneath that loneliness, beneath that uncomfortable stillness, something else begins to emerge, something older, something more powerful. Something most men never live long enough to discover, because they run from it, they escape it, they drown it in distractions, in relationships that weaken them, in attention that sedates them, in noise that keeps them asleep. But the man who stays alone long enough begins to see reality differently. He begins to see himself differently, and what he discovers will either break him completely or transform him into someone unrecognizable. At first, the loneliness feels like withdrawal, like losing an addiction he didn't realize he had, because modern relationships condition men to depend on external emotional stimulation, to depend on someone else's presence to feel grounded, to depend on someone else's approval to feel worthy. And when that disappears, it exposes a psychological vacuum. And this vacuum is terrifying, not because it is empty, but because it forces him to confront himself without distraction. Without illusion, without performance, he can no longer hide behind the role of boyfriend. He can no longer use affection as a shield against his own insecurities. He can no longer outsource his sense of identity to someone else's perception of him. And in this raw state, he meets the version of himself he has been avoiding for years. The version that questions his direction, his purpose, his strength, his discipline, and most men cannot tolerate this confrontation, so they rush back into relationships. Not out of love, but out of fear, fear of facing themselves, fear of sitting alone in a room with their own thoughts, fear of discovering that they have built their entire emotional stability on external foundations that were never truly under their control. But the man who does not run, the man who remains alone, begins to experience something unexpected, something subtle at first, almost imperceptible. He begins to reclaim his mental sovereignty. He begins to notice that his decisions are no longer influenced by the need to maintain someone else's emotional comfort. He begins to notice that his time belongs entirely to him. His energy belongs entirely to him. His focus belongs entirely to him. And this is when his mind begins to reorganize itself. Because the male brain, when removed from constant emotional negotiation, naturally shifts toward problem solving, toward creation, toward structure, toward mastery. He begins to think longer, deeper, more clearly. He begins to analyze his life not from the perspective of maintaining emotional harmony, but from the perspective of building something meaningful, something permanent, something that cannot abandon him. Visually, the scene opens in a dimly lit apartment, early morning light cutting through the blinds, dust particles floating in the air. A man sitting at the edge of his bed, no notifications on his phone, no messages waiting, just silence, and instead of panic, there is hesitation, then observation, then acceptance. His breathing slows, his posture changes, he stands up, walks to the window, and for the first time he is not reacting to the world. He is observing it, detached, calm, present. And this is the beginning of psychological independence, the moment when a man stops defining himself through his accessibility to others and begins defining himself through his alignment with himself. What most people never understand is that solitude is not the absence of connection. It is the removal of interference. Because when a man lives alone without a girlfriend, he enters a state of psychological clarity that is impossible to achieve when he is constantly adapting himself to someone else's emotional fluctuations. He no longer needs to explain himself. He no longer needs to justify his ambitions. He no longer needs to negotiate his priorities, and in that freedom, his true nature begins to surface. His real interests, his real thoughts, his real standards, and this process is uncomfortable because it dismantles the artificial personality he constructed to maintain relationships. It exposes the difference between who he really is and who he pretended to be to remain accepted. And this exposure is painful, but it is necessary, because you cannot build a powerful identity on a dishonest foundation. The camera shifts to a late-night scene, the man sitting alone at a desk, the room illuminated only by a single lamp, shadows stretching across the walls. His face calm, focused, no interruptions, no emotional noise, just him and his thoughts. And in this moment, he begins to experience something rare in the modern world: uninterrupted cognition. The ability to think deeply without being pulled in 100 different emotional directions. And this is where transformation begins, not in chaos, but in silence, not in attention, but in isolation, because isolation removes performance. And when performance disappears, authenticity emerges. Men who live alone without a girlfriend begin to develop an internal stability that is invisible to the outside world. They become less reactive, less needy, less dependent on validation. They begin to observe more and speak less. They begin to choose more carefully who they allow into their lives, because they no longer fear being alone. And this is the shift that changes everything. Because the man who does not fear being alone cannot be manipulated by the threat of abandonment. He cannot be controlled through emotional leverage. He cannot be pressured into tolerating disrespect, because his baseline state is already independence, and independence removes vulnerability to emotional coercion. The world may look at him and assume he is lonely, but what they do not see is the psychological discipline forming beneath the surface. They do not see the mental resilience being built in silence. They do not see the emotional autonomy strengthening with each passing day. Because real power does not announce itself. It develops quietly, invisibly, internally, until one day, it becomes undeniable, not through words but through presence. Through calmness, through the absence of desperation, through the absence of neediness, through the quiet confidence of a man who knows he does not require external validation to exist fully. Another visual sequence unfolds, showing him walking alone through a crowded street at night, surrounded by couples, noise, laughter, movement. Yet he walks calmly, unaffected, not because he cannot have connection, but because he no longer depends on it for his sense of worth. His identity is no longer anchored to someone else's presence. It is anchored within himself. And this internal anchoring creates a stability that cannot be easily shaken by rejection, by loss, by abandonment. Because he has already faced the deepest form of isolation and survived it, and survival transforms fear into strength. Over time, his priorities begin to change. He becomes more selective, more intentional, more protective of his energy. He stops chasing attention and starts attracting respect, not because he tries to impress others, but because he is no longer trying at all. He is simply existing in alignment with himself. And this authenticity is rare because most people are constantly performing, constantly adjusting themselves to maintain acceptance. But the man who has learned to live alone has nothing to prove, nothing to negotiate, nothing to hide. The final scene emerges slowly, the same apartment, but everything feels different. The lighting is brighter, the environment more structured, more intentional. The man stands in the center of the room, calm, composed, not incomplete, not broken, but whole. And this is the truth that nobody tells men. Living alone without a girlfriend does not diminish a man. It reveals him, it strips away illusions. It removes dependencies. It forces him to confront himself honestly. And in that confrontation, he either collapses into weakness or rises into strength. And the man who rises becomes something rare in the modern world. A man who is not controlled by loneliness, not defined by relationships, not dependent on validation, but grounded in himself, stable in himself, complete in himself. And from that position, he no longer seeks connection out of fear, but chooses it out of strength. And that difference changes everything. Because a man who is complete alone cannot be broken by the presence or absence of anyone else. He becomes immovable, undeniable, and free.